Hello, my name is Francis Young, and I am a professional indexer and also a historian who's written a number of local history books and indexed many, many books. And in this talk, I'm just going to give some initial ideas about how you might go about indexing a local history book. The first question that I want to address is why we might want to index a history book to begin with. First of all, I'm committed to improving the quality of local history books, many of which lack an index. And this is a particular problem because an index is an integral part of any book. Indexing is part of the editorial process. When you index your book, it's one way of realizing how much there is in that book and understanding the structure of that book. It's also to do with the accessibility of information. If a book isn't indexed, then it's very difficult for people to use that book for research, to find one specific piece of information that they're looking for in the text. An index is a crucial piece of critical apparatus that adds lasting academic value to a book. And it's also to do with credibility. To give you one example of that, librarians, particularly in academic libraries, will decide where a book should be stored on the basis of whether it has an index. So if a book has an index, it's much more likely that that book will be available on open shelves, available to readers to consult. If it doesn't have an index, then it will often be dismissed as essentially ephemera, something which is not of lasting importance. It will be kept within the library's collections, but probably won't be accessible unless you specifically call it up. So it's something that makes your book much more accessible. And I'd also say that there's no substitute for an analytical index. So some people will say, well, I've published my book as an ebook, and that ebook is searchable. Well, a searchable ebook is not the same as having an index, as hopefully you'll see once I explain some of the issues to do with compiling an index. So let's take a look first of all at the elements of an index. Well, an index to a local history book will typically contain three elements. The first would be an index of names, and that might well be a separate document, or it could be integrated into a single index with everything else. An index of places, again, that could be a separate document or integrated. And then an index of themes, sometimes known as an index of subjects. And what are the stages of indexing? Well, in the first place, it's important to prepare an index list. That's simply a list of all the terms, names, places, and themes that you would like to be included in your index. And it's important that that's created from the final word processed files of your book. There's no point doing that while the book is still in progress. It needs to be something that's done when the text of the book is finished. And then the second stage of indexing is completing the index, and that's something that will happen from the final typeset proofs. So that's when you receive those final typeset proofs back from the publisher, or if it's something that you're self-publishing, when you've generated that final proof that is as the text will appear on the printed page. And that's crucially important because there's no point compiling an index when page numbers are not accurate. So it's crucial that it's done, that final stage of putting in the page numbers when the PDF proof is in its final stage, because otherwise those page numbers will clearly be incorrect. Well, let's look at the different stages of an index, the elements of an index. Well, the first one is going to be indexing names. And my first bit of advice on this would be to aim for comprehensiveness. So any personal name that occurs within a book that's about local history should be indexed. I can think of very few exceptions to that, except perhaps when you're discussing fictional characters, you might want to not index those. Another point to bear in mind is that if you're writing a book, for example, about the Middle Ages or about the early modern era, when you have less standardization of spelling, a name might appear in a number of different variants, so it's very important to ensure that all of those variant spellings are indexed under a single entry. And that's just one example of why a text search in an ebook just simply isn't good enough compared with an index, because one of the things the indexer does, particularly in a history book, is to go through that entire book and ensure that a single name, a single person, a single place is indexed in one place, even when there's a lot of variant spellings involved, which obviously is something a computer is not able to do. And I would also caution you to beware of people who are known interchangeably by a name or a title. Bishops would be a classic example, so you might have a reference to the Bishop of Carlisle, or you might have a reference to the name of the person who was Bishop of Carlisle, but you need to ensure that both are indexed under that person's name with the identifying title. Noble titles are another example that can trip the indexer up. So somebody could be known as the Earl of Derwentwater, or could be known as James Radcliffe. Equally, those things could be interchangeable and need to be indexed under a single person. And of course, you as the author of the book will be in the best place to know who is the person being referred to, whether they're being referred to under their name or under their title. When it comes to indexing places, well, the things that I've mentioned already would still apply. Aim for comprehensiveness, ensure you've covered variant spellings. But I'd also say ensure identifying geographical information is included. And that, of course, is because place names might occur, the same place names, in more than one county. So ensure that the county is identified or the local authority. Let's talk about indexing themes, and this is probably more challenging than indexing names and places. My first bit of advice would be have a good example of an index to hand, so an index that you yourself have used and you know is a good index, and that gives you a pattern, if you like, of how to compile a good index and what a good index should look like. The real challenge of indexing themes is selecting for salience. So you're not trying to index every word in the book. An index is not the same as a concordance. You're trying to select what you think are the most important things that need to be indexed. Now, one way of doing that is if you've used subheadings in your book, then clearly if something is a subheading, then it's something that should be indexed. Secondly, who are the people likely to read your book is a good question to always ask. And what are they likely to be searching for? What kind of interests are they going to have? What disciplines are they going to come from? And also think about whether you might need to include sub-entries. That's when you've got an indented entry under a main index entry in order to create greater subtlety and detail in your index. So what does the process look like? Well, there's an indexing function in Microsoft Word. My advice would be, if you're new to this, not to use that unless you want to create a hyperlinked index for an ebook, and that's quite a technical process. So my advice would be to avoid that indexing function and instead read the entire manuscript, creating the index list as you go, and that's something that can be done before the final proofs are completed, but after the text has been finalized. And then when the PDF proofs are ready, either from your publisher or from yourself if you're self-publishing, use them to add the page numbers to the index list, and then that final index proof can then be created where all the page numbers are correct. One final thing to think about is the issue of page range. An index is not simply a search that identifies every instance of a term, and some bad indexes that you'll see in books are just a whole load of individual numbers. Instead, if a term is being discussed over several pages, the page range should be included and not just the individual entries. So that's important when particularly thinking about themes, or sometimes about people and places, that the entire page range over which that person or that place is discussed is included. And sometimes it's a judgment call as to whether you consider that that theme or that person or that place is genuinely being discussed across the whole page range. And that's something which, as you get more into indexing, you'll develop more of an instinct for how that should be done. Now, obviously, there's a great deal more to say about indexing, but I believe that by improving the indexes of local history books, local history can be given more prominence, can be made more accessible, particularly to scholars in academia. And I think it breeds greater respect if we ensure that as many local history books as possible have got an index, because that index is a crucial piece of critical apparatus and really a mark of the quality of a book and the level of detail that's gone into the preparation of that book. So I would strongly advise anyone who's writing a local history book, no matter how short that book appears to be, no matter how few people you think are going to read your book, I would still advise you that it's worth having an index, it's worth putting in that effort, and hopefully these have given you a few tips about how to begin approaching that process. Thank you very much.